Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Antonio Hardin. I'm the director of the child psychiatry here at Stanford. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar titled Pediatric Anxiety Disorders, Cognitive Behavioral Strategy to Help Kids Cope. It's being given by Dr. Shay Ferrigan, who is a clinical assistant professor here at Stanford University, and she is the co-director of the anxiety clinic here at Stanford. Before asking Dr. Ferrigan to start, I just want to thank her for her willingness to give a presentation on this topic, and I want to thank everyone who's joining us today. As you all know, we've been participating in the Stanford Pediatric Mental Health Project for Ukraine that include different components. The first one is webinars on different topics related to kids with autism, but also to typically developing children, similar to the topic that we are having today. We also involved in a toy drive in collaboration and in coordination with Child with Future. Today's webinar will be on anxiety for neurotypical kids or typically developing children. We have about 1 hour and a half, and we are looking forward to this presentation. I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, please send them through the Q&A. And if they are not in English, we have Daria here who will be translating them into English. And also, as you all know, we have 2 people who are be translating or interpreting in Russian. The first one is Irena will be translating into Russian, and Dimitri translating into Ukrainian. So thank them. I want to thank them for this. And then without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Ferrigan.
Thank you, Dr. Hardin. Good afternoon and good evening to everyone. Thank you guys for having me. Today, I'll talk about cognitive behavioral strategies for pediatric anxiety disorders. I'm going to share some of the core principles of applying CBT to treat anxiety disorders. But I want to pause first and recognize the context in which I'm sharing this material. While I'm going to share the kind of textbook applications of CBT for anxiety, the questions of how do I apply this in the current setting? That's definitely not textbook. Or what if anxiety and worry is perhaps reasonable to the overpowering context and environment right now are questions that are present in my mind. So as I talk about these key principles, we can think together on how they can be flexed to meet the needs of the children and the teens that you coach and care about. The anxiety that they're experiencing may not be unreasonable, but some of the strategies here can help not only make anxiety more manageable, but increase the tolerance for it, a sense that they're not alone with it, and that there are tools they could try. What we know about trauma and anxiety is that parents, caregivers, and coaches, their response to the child's anxiety is associated with how well a child can cope. We clearly can't change the circumstances right now, but what we can is keep trying to respond in ways that are safe and warm and helpful to children. So worry and anxiety, as you guys know, are both natural, normal, and really important aspects of human development. I mean, as children and teens explore their environment and grow, they naturally grapple with, how do I know if the unknown, the uncertain, the unpredictable is safe or not? So here are some really common worries kids experience throughout development as they start to test out their environment. And this hesitation of like, is the unknown safe or dangerous, has protective qualities. We consider anxiety and fear to be our evolutionarily developed alarm system that really signals the brain and our body that danger is present. You need to protect yourself. And this alarm system is critically important. And it can become overly sensitive for a variety of reasons, especially if children and teens have experienced trauma or in environments that are chronically unstable or uncertain. The mind and the body can say, we need to be on high alert. And the threshold for that alarm can be much lower, often causing what in CBT we refer to as a false alarm, where the child feels that like adrenaline, fear, and a worry level in their brain and body of it being a true danger, when perhaps the worry thought they're having is just a thought, rather than them actually being in a dangerous situation themselves. So I'm going to talk about the differences between those typical anxiety and worry, and when does it become more problematic? And then what do we do about it? So transitory anxiety or helpful typical anxiety is on this table on the left. And we think about it as reasonable for kind of the situation or the age the kid is at. It usually diminishes in intensity over time. The kid benefits from your response or your reassurance, like, oh, there's no monster under the bed. It usually helps them grow or change. And over time, the child starts to learn to understand their fear and conquer it. Naturally goes away over time without kind of needing a lot of support. When we think of it as more problematic anxiety, is when it's either out of proportion, not always, some contexts are just really hard, or out of sync with their developmental stage. So an older child who's in high school, who's still really, really scared of the dark, it actually increases in intensity over time. It starts to take on a life of its own and really get in the way of the child's day-to-day activities. We notice that reassurance is just not enough. No answer is really good enough that a parent, a coach, a friend can give. It really stops their own growth or their day-to-day functioning. And they start to focus on doing things to avoid that feeling, avoid things that might cause the distress. Now, of course, some is really reasonable, right? And really typical developmental markers that we need to build bravery. But what we want to think about is is it getting in the way of their day-to-day functioning and making it really hard to engage in the things they'd like to be doing? We think about pediatric anxiety as being really hallmarked by this persistent pattern of overestimating how bad things are and underestimating our ability to cope. For example, tendency to catastrophize, maximize negative outcomes. We have here a kitten overestimating is having kind of the gut reaction to, this is a terrible and ferocious animal, I have to run away. They're not able to logically rationalize and see, well, it's new, it's scary, but it's quite small, and I'm quite large. This pattern of kind of maladaptive thinking is where kids with anxiety get stuck. I want to recognize that in the current situation, kids may not be overestimating how bad things are. But what we can work on is how can we help them develop their ability to say, this is really hard and I'm doing it, that they are coping, they're living through it day to day. And how can we increase those skills? So as coaches, parents, we're going to utilize the cognitive behavioral framework to understand this pattern of problematic anxiety. CBT is an evidence-based intervention and model. That's the front line or gold standard treatment for problematic anxiety. And at its core, if you're not familiar with it, is the cognitive triangle that really here visualizes how our thoughts, our emotions or sensations, and our actions and behaviors are dynamically intertwined and linked. When we experience a strong anxious emotion, like a fear of a dog, we're also experiencing problematic or worry thoughts. So for example, like, I can't go outside, there might be a dog that will hurt me. And problematic actions associated with it, like refusing to go outside, refusing to go new places if a dog's going to be there. Our thoughts impact how we feel at all times. So not just when we're feeling overwhelmed, but even just thinking about for you today, or this morning, your alarm went off, maybe it didn't, maybe something else woke you up. What jumped into your mind when you first woke up? For me, it was, I have a presentation. That thought generated a healthy amount of anxiety or stress, motivating me to get right out of bed, rather than maybe taking a moment to stay in bed or snooze. And so then, I got out of bed, reviewed the presentation, and I felt accomplished. I thought, oh, I got that done. Now I can go on to the next thing. My actions influenced my feelings and my thoughts. And when someone experiences a problematic level of anxiety, it's not around the feeling itself, but it's the impact that that feeling has on their behavior and their thinking. We actually don't try to change the problematic feeling itself. Maybe you can even think about a time someone said, don't worry about it. Don't feel sad. And I want to think about how often that was helpful. It usually isn't. So we're going to look together at what CBT can do to change thoughts and behaviors to help with our feelings. Here's an example of how these three parts can break down. We might have worry thoughts of, I can't handle this. Start thinking of the worst case scenario. Feeling worried, but also feeling it in our body, shaking, sweating, scared. And then we engage in different behaviors because of this. Often it's avoiding the feeling, but that could be acting out, yelling, anger, tearfulness. There's a lot of ways that the feeling of worry can change our behaviors, especially for kids and teens. So let's look at the cycle of anxiety, where we can utilize this knowledge that our feelings, thoughts, and actions are connected to make some changes. So anxiety tends to, but not always, follow a really predictable pattern. And I want to walk through that pattern together. So at the top of the circle is something called a trigger. And I use that word here as really any prompting event or situation. So for example, let's say a child is highly fearful of dogs. That might not be the most relevant to any of you right now, but I'm going to use it as an example just to understand the concepts. If a child who has a fear of dogs sees that while you're trying to walk outside, that there's a bunch of dogs walking down the street, even if they were really excited to go outside or do something, they might notice that all of a sudden they're complaining of a tummy ache, a headache, saying, I really am not comfortable, something bad's going to happen. That can also be, again, anger, irritability. it isn't really necessarily problematic yet that they're feeling that. The feeling itself isn't problematic. It's what they are going to do next about the feeling. So in their mind and their body, they notice these worry feelings. And then what they may say is, grown up, caregiver, I don't want to go. I'm not going. They may claim illness, just flat out refuse, throw a temper tantrum. And this is when anxiety becomes problematic. The child or teen is avoiding the situation because they want to avoid sitting with and coping with the distress, which is natural. No one really likes feeling distressed. We call that avoidance. Now, I want to highlight sometimes, avoidance can be helpful, and I'll talk about that. But what happens is when kids avoid these feelings by either not going outside in that situation, it works. Their stress, their worry goes away a little bit. The challenge is that makes it so that the next time they see a dog or they feel distressed and anxious in their body or mind, they've learned avoiding the feeling is the only way to cope with it. Avoiding the situation is the only way to cope with it. And it becomes their go-to strategy. The way we break this cycle is not targeting, reducing, or changing the worry feeling or the distress directly. It's by changing the behaviors we take and how we respond to them. And now I want to be really clear that avoidance is not always a problem. A big theme here is it depends. There, as we said, are evolutionary and biological reasons for avoidance. Kids may not be overestimating how bad things are, but they may be underestimating or not aware of their own incredible ability to cope. And that's where you as a coach or a parent can sit in a difficult situation with them and help them see this is incredibly hard and they can do it. They actually probably already are. Avoidance can take on many forms. So here are some of the ways that I've included. They may be asking parents excessive or coaches extra questions, physically just not going to something. It may be having safety objects or items that they always have to have with them. There may be some rituals they have to do that if they don't do, they become very distressed. And the reason avoidance is so concerning is that it takes away kids' confidence, choice, self-efficacy, being able to do what they want, and fun. So we want to think about children are not incapable of facing their feelings. We just need to give them better tools. The target of CBT is then not to eliminate the feeling of anxiety, but to increase kids' and teens' tolerance of it and try to decrease their thinking and behavioral avoidance of the feeling. When we try to avoid it, it actually makes that feeling more powerful and learn that it's really, really something bad we need to avoid rather than something we can live with and live through. So here we're not going to change the feelings. We're really going to focus on the behaviors. In turn, those feelings will likely go down. So cognitive behavioral therapy can be adapted to lots of different and flex to lots of different needs. I'm going to talk about the core tenets here. And we think about them as kind of stepping stones. They each build upon each other. I have a child or a caregiver here and a child, and they're starting at the bottom of the staircase, and they're going to work their way to the top. So as we go through these different tenets, you may move more quickly through some. You may notice that some are more challenging working with kids or your child or who you're coaching with, but we can flex each of them. The first one is setting behavioral goals. I've said it many times, but we're not going to set a goal of trying to feel less anxious, trying to worry less. What we're going to do is try to make the goal something that is observable and measurable. So something that we could see, something that you could test as a hypothesis, or a third person could kind of see, oh, the kid did that or they didn't. We want to make it realistic, so something the kid can do, and specific. Because again, when kids are worried, they stop doing things that they would otherwise do. And this is a way to help them start doing those things again to reduce anxiety. I have some examples here of good goals or goals that are less effective. So be less worried when you make mistakes, not a great behavioral goal. Again, it's focusing on the feeling. Maybe for a kid who's really fearful of being in bed by themselves, laying in bed for 10 minutes with the lights off by yourself would be a great goal. Because if they can do that, it means they're able to tolerate anxiety and stress. Don't complain when we go outside. For those of you who might have kids you work with who, do a lot of complaining, maybe flipping that to being able to go for a walk outside for 5 minutes. Kids who are afraid to make mistakes purposely make a mistake in your painting. Being able to tolerate those pieces. We want to make those goals really collaborative and really clear with the kid. Everyone's in agreement of what the goal is. It's not a goal parent has or coach has for the kid. It's a goal you guys name and label together. Transparency in CBT is very, very important. The next is to build a common language around emotions or affect identification. Humans in general sometimes struggle to really recognize their own emotions, and it can feel like in this image of different ones jumbling around in their body. Anxious kids in particular tend to have difficulty distinguishing between their feelings. Often something I see is kids who tell me, I just feel weird. I feel bad. But they struggle to label that besides a good emotion or a bad emotion or a different emotion. Ways to do this in CBT can be really playful and fun and take a lot of different shapes. You can do it as simple as emotion like charades, where I'll make a facial expression and have them guess what feeling I'm trying to act out, and vice versa. You can do it one I do if you have any paper around, often is the game memory, where there's lots of cards laid out that I've made. Some may be like smiley faces or like emotion faces that I've drawn, and then feelings words, and they try to find ones that match. It could be situations and feelings words that they try to find that match. Playful ways to help them start thinking about emotions and how they might feel in different situations and how you distinguish those emotions. Bingo can be another one. Some kids just make an emotion dictionary or an emotion chart where they draw pictures and add emotion words under. Ways to make sure that when you and them are referring to an emotion, you're talking about it the same way, and you have a sense that they really understand what that emotion is. The next part of building a common language around anxiety and emotion is a feelings thermometer. And this is really at the heart of a lot of the work we do in anxiety, is helping teach kids that emotions come in different sizes and intensities. Emotions aren't just a light switch that go on and off, but they're more like a dimmer switch where they can go up or they can go down slightly. They also aren't just good emotions or bad emotions. All emotions are good. And it's how intense you're feeling them. By recognizing how they feel on a thermometer of different intensities, you can also start to recognize where they have more ability to cope. For example, how worried or anxious would you feel if you were jumping out of an airplane? I can tell you, for me, I would be a 5 up here. I would be like, oh my gosh, I need some help. That is not something I would like. Maybe one of you would say, oh, that sounds really fun. Maybe you're a thrill seeker. For a kid playing their favorite game, Recognizing that picking their favorite game might be a 1 for them. They might really like it. Raising their hand in school. That might be for some much harder, for others much easier. Not only does this give you a way to better identify what is hard for them, but also start to recognize that there are shades of gray in how hard things are. And it builds a language that later you'll use to say, you're feeling worried. What number are you on your scale? Okay, you're a 3. What can we do to help you get back down to a 2 or a 1? The next part of that building a common language and learning about emotions is identifying what we call body clues. I'm sure you guys know our minds and body are connected, and bodies react to worry and stress in different ways. Helping kids build their understanding that there are clues they can learn from their body about how they're feeling. That might be, noticing that when they're feeling worried, they have butterflies in their stomach. Their head starts to feel tense. They have tension in their shoulders. Some fun activities to help kids recognize this is to look at or draw pictures of animals. I have 2 cats here. And how can you tell what they're feeling? What might they be feeling? The picture of the cat on one side has its back arched. The other one looks pretty restful. This helps kids start to notice that when we have tension, we're feeling anxious, stressed, scared, we start to tense our bodies, or our bodies have these clues or signals to us and to other people. They're feeling tense. We can also use paper to trace a kid's body and have them draw in where in their body they start to feel the tension, how they feel when they're stressed out, where they feel when they're happy, to start to help them recognize there's clues in our body. Because once we have a common language of emotions, can start seeing and monitoring what it feels like in our body and our mind and how intense it is, that gives a really strong connection between coach and parent and kid to communicate about the stress and anxiety. It also helps us understand the problem so we can then think about what to do with it. There are some things behaviors we can actually do to lower our emotional temperature. Some of them, relaxation skills, may be easier or harder for you to do in the current context. Some of the ones that kids can carry with them no matter where they are, and adults, are some of the diaphragmatic breathing, really helping them notice that when we're stressed out, we're breathing really shallow in our chest. But if we can take really deep belly breaths, it can slow or calm our body to calm our mind. A great activity I often do with that is having kids imagine that they're smelling a rose or smelling a flower or a birthday cake, something that smells delicious, their favorite food, maybe pizza. And then they will go ahead afterwards and blow out like they're either blowing bubbles from a bubble wand or blowing out a candle. So breathing in really deep and blowing out, recognizing that if you blow out your birthday candles like this, you're not going to get all of them. Thinking about having them imagine there's a balloon in their belly and can they breathe it all the way full, all the way to the top, and then slowly let out the air for 10 seconds. Those are things we can do that actually calm our body, that will in turn calm our mind. Another one we often use is progressive muscle relaxation, where we alternate between tensing our muscles and relaxing them. There are a lot of great YouTube videos on this you may be familiar with. Some of the ones I really enjoy using with kids and teens have to do with kind of imagining that they're squeezing lemons to make lemonade, and they need to squeeze every last drop to really tense their fists and muscles and let go. There's ones that we can do where we're imagining that there's a fly on our nose and we're going to scrunch it up really, really, really tight to get away from that fly. So there's playful and silly ways that no matter the environment you're in, for even a moment, You can engage a child to make that lemonade, to try to calm their body, to help calm their mind. And the last one is engaging in senses. These are just some examples, but our senses can really help calm our mind and our bodies. And so either if there's a pleasant scent that they can either imagine or smell, an image, real or imagined. So perhaps a special place like, laying their head on their mother's lap, or a place they would love to imagine going to, like a quiet and calming beach or a field with lots of horses. If they can close their eyes and imagine that, even for a moment, it can calm the body and mind. And the last one is pleasant sounds. So if there are really sounds that they really enjoy hearing, those are also ways to engage the senses, to calm the body, to calm the mind. Other actions and behaviors that can help and may or may not be helpful in your circumstance is for them to go for a walk, use their body, take a warm bath or shower, write in a journal, play with a pet, write a letter that they never send. All of these are actions that when their emotional temperature is high, they could use to calm it. And then to say, okay, what number were you before on your worry scale? What number are you after? To just help them see, is there a change? Maybe there wasn't. Did it get worse? And if it didn't get worse, saying, okay, well, you did this and it didn't get worse. Or did it get better? So they can see that there are things that they can do to lower that temperature themselves. The next part that's really, really key, the third part of CBT, is something we called exposures. And now exposures may or may not be the most helpful if the fear the child is having or teen is experiencing is related to a current real threat. So if a child is experiencing a current real threat, then perhaps doing an exposure, exposing them to the thing they're afraid of, may be less helpful because they're actually in danger. Exposures are best used when it's something, a situation or event that a child or a teen is very fearful of, that they're avoiding, and we want to gradually have them work their way up to doing, experiencing, and tolerating. So for example, if a child, as I've mentioned, is afraid of dogs, working our way up to having them be around dogs, exposing themselves to them in little gradual doses until their body and mind has learned, I can tolerate this. At the heart of exposure, which is really the crux of a lot of anxiety treatment, is this gradual progression of helping kids get habituated or used to the distress around a situation. Reminds me of if you're going to go into a really cold ocean and you put, some people might be willing to run and just dive right into it. Many people might put their toe in and be like, yikes, this is really cold. Not interested in going in the cold water. But if they sit there with their toes in the water for a long enough time, their body gets used to it. And then they can take an inch forward and they can put up to their, shins. And if they wait, even though it's cold when they put their shins in, they can step a little bit more up into their knees and so on and so forth until they can fully be in the water or in the pool. And so exposure does that, where we learn to tolerate the discomfort, manage the stress, and build confidence that we can do hard things. The fear reaction that's been conditioned to the stimulus, so conditioned to dogs, conditioned to talking out loud, conditioned to going outside, kind of gets weaker and weaker the more we have evidence that I can be around dogs. I can go outside, even if it's for 5 minutes. And new associations are built for kids. And that avoidance that fuels the anxiety cycle is removed. So kids learn that that's no longer the only or best way to tolerate distress. And the more you practice doing the thing that's hard in incremental doses, the less distressing it can become and the less likely you will be to try to avoid. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. How we do that in treating anxiety is at first we want to learn what's the kid afraid of, and we want to make a list of all the things related to the kid's worry. So if a kid is really, really worried about dogs, it would be tell me every single thing. What about if you saw a dog at a park? What about if you went to a house where there was a dog? What about if you ended up alone in the street with a dog? What about petting a dog? All these different scenarios. And you might write them out on pieces of paper. And then have the kid arrange them into categories of low, like this would be not too hard, but somewhat hard, medium of like so-so, and hard. Then you can go back to that worry scale, which I showed a 0 to 5 rating. Some people use a 0 to 10. With little kids, sometimes we use a 0 to 3, and have them rate how hard each scenario would be for them on that scale so that we can see some are easier, some are in the middle, and some are hard. This also teaches them, again, that it's not, I can't be near a dog at all, or if I'm not scared, I'd be able to be around them, but that there's shades of gray and there's some wiggle room that they can have. As you're noticing, I'm kind of putting my hands like small, medium, high, because they kind of make a ladder or a staircase that we're going to take as stepping stones, one to the next to get to them. If we had a kid who is never terrified of dogs, and we said, okay, great, we're just going to have you go hang out with dogs and become a dog trainer. If there's no stairs there, they're going to fall. We need to build stepping stones to help them get there. Here, I want to highlight that what we want to do with this staircase is be really gradual in building them. So rather than throwing a kid into a deep end of you now need to live with 45 dogs, which if that's the circumstance that has to happen, that has to happen. But in an ideal world for coaching, for working with your children, we'd like to have it be gradual. Think about it as if your child knows how to ride a bike or knows how to swim. They learned it in gradual stages, perhaps going into the water in the shallow end, then with floaties, then swimming by themselves. Riding a bike, they probably had a tricycle, maybe some training wheels, and then a bicycle. So here is an example of a fear, what we call ladder or staircase for fear of dogs. A 1 on that scale might be for the kid to look at a picture of a dog. And maybe we want to put even a time limit on it. Look at the picture for 5 minutes. The next might be watch a YouTube video of the dog. Go to a shelter and look at dogs and crates. Stand in a room with a dog and then to pet it. Helping them see that there are parts that are easier and harder and then taking those steps. I'm going to walk through an example of what that looks like. So if you're actually, once you've set up the exposure, the kid knows this roadmap of how you're going to get there. And again, it's very transparent and the kid knows. You pick one of the steps of the ladder to start with on the lower rungs. You pick it ahead of time with the kid so they know exactly what to expect. And we do the exposure where they, in this case, would look at a picture of a dog. This example here, they actually are going to look at the dog in a shelter. They're higher up. They've made some progress in treatment. So at the top here, it says the child looks at the dog in the shelter. The goal of the exposure is that the child is going to be anxious. It's not that they would look at the dog in the shelter and be like, okay, this is fine. We actually want them to feel that distress, feel the anxiety, and still do the exposure. Keep looking at the dog. We'd like it to be not a 5 out of 5 on their thermometer, because that might be too hard, but in the middle. Have enough distress where they're worried, but not too hard. Continue looking at the dog until what happens is the distress goes down and they're no longer worried about it. They get used to it. On occasion, the distress won't go down. Maybe they had picked a 3 out of 5 on their worry thermometer for this, and it stays at a 3 the whole time. Even if it doesn't go down, they are able to keep doing it. And even though it was hard, they got used to it. They stayed with it. What happens next is what we want is the coaches, parents, teachers, the caregivers to praise the child for their brave behavior. Praise them for what they did. Even if they were feeling so scared, ignoring that part and saying, you did this, this was hard and you did it. What the child sees and learns is, I can do this. This is hard, but I can do it. And what we want to do is stay with that one exposure and practice it over and over and over until a kid's mastered it. And then go up the next step on that staircase. Just as if you were teaching a child to swim, you would want to make sure they knew how to swim, without their floaties in the shallow end before you moved them up to the deep end. So you'd want to have them go to the pool over and over and over to make sure they'd mastered that skill before you put them up to the next one. But you also don't want to stop them from ever going up to the next step. We want to make sure they're making gradual progression. Sometimes when we're doing exposures, a child's anxiety actually goes up, and it can get up to the top of their worry thermometer. And if a child says, I can't do it, what we want to try to challenge them to think of is, I hear you. What can you do right now? Not trying to rescue them or let them avoid, not punishing them for not being able to, but trying to help them again see there's options. What do you think you could do? Could they go outside the shelter and just listen to the dogs barking? How can they stay in the exposure, but maybe adjust it just a little bit? We often, with anxiety, like to use reward systems to reinforce that the child did a good job. To build intrinsic motivation of, I want to challenge my worry, that can be pretty hard for kids and teens. And so it can be helpful to use external motivators. Now, people may have more or less access to those or how they value that. And in no way is a reward necessarily like a tangible item or money. A reward could be getting 5 extra minutes of snuggles with mom or a caretaker before bed. It could be getting to pick where they sit for dinner. It could be getting to pick the radio station that you listen to. It could be getting to pick an extra book at bedtime. All of those are really good rewards and motivators. It's picking something that would be rewarding for your child and they'd be motivated to be able to have. If you use a reward system for them being able to do their exposure, we notice it'll increase the likelihood they'll be willing to do it because there's something exciting for them afterwards. But it needs to be consistent and predictable. So they should know about what the reward is beforehand and get it right afterwards. Only have the kid earn that reward if they did the exposure. If they weren't able to, it's not punishment. It's just, okay, we'll try again next time. It's different than what we call a bribe. I'll talk more about that. And again, you don't have to spend money on it. It can be simple things that just motivate them. Sometimes in the work I do, parents and coaches and teachers have a concern that rewards can feel like they're bribing their child, that's the only way they're getting them to do the challenging, to challenge their worry. So I wanted to spend a moment just to highlight the differences between those two as we think about it in cognitive behavioral therapy. So a bribe would be something that happens in the moment, kind of out of desperation from the parent or coach. Like, if you do this, you can have whatever you want for dinner, please, please, please. You're kind of throwing whatever you can at the child to get them to do what you want. A bribe also kind of offers maybe something you previously didn't want to have the child or teen have, or can't really don't want to offer. And it often doesn't match the like level of effort required by the child. Maybe you're like, you can have extra, reading time for the next year. Maybe that's not, that's a bit of a big reward for, looking at a picture of a dog. A reward is different because you decide beforehand with the child and the parent or coach together. It reminds the child of the agreement and the plan, and it matches the effort. So it is motivating, but it's really, again, going back to that transparent, collaborative plan. Okay. The last part I'm going to talk about today is how to build coping language and thoughts. We've talked about setting a goal that's behavioral. We've talked about building that emotion language, especially for children who are taught or speak different languages in different environments. It can be exceptionally challenging to develop an emotion language with a caregiver or with others. So really trying to cultivate that, and also cultivating that those emotions can come on a scale. They're not just turning on or off. They're not just good emotions or bad. All emotions are welcome. It's how intense or problematic they are. We talked about how to challenge kids to build bravery muscles. Perhaps that can even just include for a kid who feels like they can't possibly tolerate another day without their father, of being like, or they can't tolerate without asking mom and dad or mom about their father. Let's see if they can go 5 minutes. The last part here is building coping thoughts and for the kid and for the parent or the coach. What we know is what adults say can become kids' and teens' internal voices. What they hear becomes their inner monologue. So for parents and coaches and teachers, rather than trying to tell kids not to worry, trying to label their anxiety, model that you can help them identify the emotion they're feeling. Worry is making it hard for you right now. Anxiety is making it hard for you right now. That also helps kids learn to do that themselves. It's not getting stuck in, I'm feeling worried, I'm feeling worried. They start to think of anxiety as a problem they can solve with you. Next is jumping in with advice. For some people, this is like a reflex. We want to solve problems for kids and help them, but we want to encourage with anxiety, bravery, and kids sitting with their distress just a little. So we want to encourage, like, what do you think you could be brave and try, rather than going in and problem solving for them, helping them develop that skill and that muscle. Instead of excessive reassurance, which is what kids with anxiety and worry really pull in us, it can make us feel worried and anxious when we don't give that. Trying to help rather than tell them it's going to be okay. That's not a problematic thing to say, but trying to help them recognize, fear is temporary. This is hard and you can do it. Rather than allowing for avoidance. When you can, try to use coaching statements. This is hard and you can do it. I'm going to come back to how to write coaching statements in a minute. And then rather punishing or shaming, trying to respond with warmth and confidence. Anxiety got the best of you today. We'll try again tomorrow. Great job working on it though. Recognizing that, again, it's not a light switch. They either did it or they didn't. It is, okay, we'll try again tomorrow. That's all right. We know that consequences and punishment doesn't work for anxiety. And so what we want to do is really come with and meet them with warmth and support. This also helps them start talking to themselves with warmth and compassion of, this was hard for me and it's okay. Another part of building that coping language is validation. So validation is something that communicates to the other person you're talking to that their feelings and thoughts and actions, they make sense. They're understandable. Validation doesn't necessarily mean you agree with it, but it means you understand where they're coming from. And as humans, being heard and understood is so meaningful. And for kids and teens with worry, feeling heard and understood is extremely, extremely important. It can also improve the coach and child relationship. It can improve the parent-child relationship and de-escalate conflict of like, you don't understand, you're not trying to help me. So we can build coping language with our kids and teens through validation by actively listening. So rather than trying to problem solve again, just letting them talk and share, being really aware of your own verbal and nonverbal reactions during it, of just kind of letting them have space, and observe what the child's feeling and using words for it. That goes back to building that common language, but offering them words for it. So I hear it feels scary to sleep by yourself. It makes sense given what's happened that it might feel scary for you or why you feel scared to sleep by yourself. It makes them feel heard. Doesn't mean you're saying you agree with it, but they understand that you're there with them. Reflecting their feelings back without judgment, correction, again, communicates that you want to understand, even if you don't get it right. And lastly, showing tolerance for emotions. Being able to sit with and tolerate the child or teen's emotions models for them that emotions aren't something that are bad and we have to get rid of, but rather that we feel they're natural and there's something we can do with them. It's okay to feel scared. Anxiety is making it hard for you right now. I hear that. If you want, you can say kind of, I wonder how loud anxiety is right now. What number is it for you? Another way to build a common understanding with each other. Support statements are a really particular part of building that coping language that can be helpful. The parts of a support statement include that validation at the beginning and adding confidence. So I see this is hard for you, and I am sure you can handle this. This is really tough, and I know you can do it. Helping have that confidence is incredibly important, but if we have confidence of you can do this without the validation, it doesn't feel as supportive. By modeling these things, you're helping kids build their internal language around it. It can also be very helpful to help kids create their own coping thoughts too. Here an example of some that a kid could write down, you could practice as a mantra that they can say to themselves as their own pep talk. If you work with kids who enjoy sports, you could show them a YouTube video of a coach in a locker room and how they give a pep talk before a game. And that pep talk has a lot of, thoughts that the players can have in their mind to kind of get them excited or help with their feelings. These coping thoughts are like pep talks, but for ourselves that we can carry around with us. This is a form, my worry thermometer, but I'm going to do it anyways. This is hard and I can do it. I feel scared and I know I'm going to be okay. They're support statements, but for themselves. You can model these through your coaching, your teaching, your parenting, and then encourage your child to create and write their own that they will say and use regularly. In fact, that can be a behavioral goal is to say out loud their coaching statement 3 times in the morning when they wake up. Those are ways that we can change our behaviors to help cope with our feelings. So I've gone through a lot of information about the core tenets of cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, this will be applied differently if a child has different types of worry or needs. If a child doesn't want to work on their worry, which can happen, and it can be flexed in many different ways. So this is not all of how to do cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety, but these are some of the basic principles you can use to integrate and start working on shifting the focus from I feel worried, to what is the worry stopping you from doing? What is the worry saying to you? What can we do to push back on the worry monster? I want to thank you guys so much for spending the time listening to me. And I'm hopeful now we can open up to questions and we can think together about how to flex these principles and models to meet the needs of the children and teens you care about and work with. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Fadigan, for this very informative presentation. I think we have several questions, but before we move on to the questions, I just want to remind people that we have a survey that was sent by Christelle for people to provide feedback on this presentation, and more importantly, to suggest topics for the future as we are expanding the scope of this effort to include typically developing kids with mental health issues. The second thing is just a reminder that next week we have Dr. Brad Zickerman and Karen Parson. Both of them are in the addiction clinic here at Stanford, and we'll be talking about different types of addiction in adolescents, including alcohol use disorder and screen addiction. We will be taking break in July, so there will not be any more any presentation during the months of July, but we'll resume in August. And starting September, we will be doing 2 seminars a month, the first and the third Wednesday of each month. Please check our website for any information about these additional webinars. And if you want to go back and look at the webinars that we've done in the past, they are also posted on our website. Very good. So let's get started here with the first question. So it's a question about a kid with autism who feels good about pretending to be angry. And the concern is that when they get angry, they might fail to pretend being angry and not actually get angry. I don't know your thoughts about that. And the question that what will be the most appropriate approach in that situation?
Yeah. That's a tough question and a great one. You know, I would encourage kids to explore their emotions, and pretending to be angry or in make-believe and play, all emotions are important to express. I think it would be how when they're pretending, what that makes them, if they makes them do anything differently that isn't in line with the family values or what's okay. So setting some limits around it if needed of it's great to pretend that you're angry. And when you're playing pretend, we still need to use a respectful voice with mom and dad, mom. We still want to, in pretend play, use gentle hands and not throw or break things. And so setting some limits around it to ensure that exploration of emotions is playful and fun, but also not something that is against what you're okay with them acting and behaving. So they're also learning some limits with that. Does that make sense? And Dr. Harden, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, I want to add two thoughts here. Is one is, and we tell that to all parents, I think experiencing emotions is very acceptable. And sometimes we want to foster that. We don't want to foster extreme emotion, but it's okay to have emotions. The problem that we want to control is that what to do with the emotion. So it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be upset, but we don't want a behavior that is not appropriate when somebody is upset, like maybe swearing at mom or throwing things. So that's one thing. Now, in this situation, and as you all know, it's very hard to project. It looks like this kid is into role playing. So that's a good, and actually that's something that we use in clinical practice to do some social stories or some role playing. And in a therapeutic environment, it will be good to practice a little bit different levels of being angry, mild, moderate to severe. And so in a way, the child learned how to control their anger and behave appropriately when they are feeling angry. The next question is regarding dogs and being afraid of dogs. And it seems this family lives in the country where there are a lot of dogs. And ironically, the child, when they see the dog, or they start screaming dogs, which maybe make the dog around them, or the dogs around them, more active, and they start barking. And the neighbors are not happy with that. So any thoughts about dog phobia or fears of dogs?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely possible for someone who has any fear to respond to it with anger or escalation or trying to probe it and prod it. So it's definitely possible that, they respond to being fearful of it by provoking the dog or trying to have like power over the dog. And so typically what we would consider or think about, I might be thinking about doing, is if the child is willing to work with you on their worry around dog or building their relationship with these dogs, is to identify on that kind of ladder of what are some of the behaviors you'd like to have your child do with the dog. And maybe it's be able to go outside with the dog and ignore them for 5 minutes, not run to the fence. And can that be a goal at the beginning, is to just go outside, and can they go and ignore them? Maybe then after that, it's being able to go over and walk over and say, hi dogs, in a calmer, quieter voice with calm hands, and using that as a target of what you'd like to see, and working with them on if they're able to do that. In these discrete practices, they can have their reward and practice that over and over and over and over again. There are also behavioral, we think, for like challenging behaviors. If someone's provoking someone, there are also other principles we can use. And I know one of my colleagues will be presenting on that, of motivating to kind of not engage in those behaviors. But that would be one of the ways for if a child is fearful of a dog, but likes to provoke them, that you could make some behavioral targets and goals for them.
Very good. Thank you. The next question about separation anxiety, and that's not unusual. That children with separation anxiety, they have reaction every time a parent, or in this situation, mom leaves the house to go to work. Any thoughts in terms of how to manage that?
This is something we work a lot on in our clinic. And so one of the things we would want to think about is how to do some practice, some exposures that aren't when you're going to work. I'm sure that means you have limited time with it because you work for the majority of the day, but on the weekends or evenings, that's when you'd want to do your exposures obviously going to work is a big exposure for the child. And what we can do is think of, a routine in the morning that's predictable, of that you will say goodbye once and those pieces. But then on the weekends or evenings, coming up with a plan of what about if mom goes, and I don't know where the living situation you're in is, but mom goes outside for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and you stay upstairs in a different room. What if mom goes and walks around the block, if you have another adult who can watch the child and they're not left alone, and goes and walks around the block? What if mom does an errand for half an hour? And try to build up these muscles of having your child be away from you and see that nothing bad happens, or they can tolerate it in small doses in these other times that will help them build up their muscles to be able to tolerate the mornings when you do have to go to work.
Yeah. I think practicing on days when the parent is not going to work, going to, doing some errands, that's very good, because it's like a muscle, and you can increase progressively the duration when the parent is away. Another suggestion that we make in these situations is kids with separation anxiety are sometimes concerned whether the parent is sick or something is happening to them. So one way that we've tried and it's been helpful is to have set times when you call the child during the day. I don't know what you think about that, Dr. Fadigan, is let's say you leave at work at 9 and you tell the child, okay, I'm gonna call you at 10 o'clock, at noon, 1 p.m., and I will see you back at home at 3, something like that. So these anchors help kids with anxiety, that they will be hearing from their parent around specific times. Any thoughts about that, Dr. Fadigan?
I think that can be a helpful tool to start with. If your child's not asking for that, it could be helpful to do like we'll check in for 5 minutes at lunchtime. I want to hear what you had for lunch, and focus on something like that, or change up the times you're doing it each day so it doesn't become too much of a crutch. And then working in that progressive, gradual nature to reduce those calls or reduce those talks to maybe a note in the morning that you leave in their lunchbox, or something at the end of the day, so that they can exactly build that muscle. So having those there in the interim, but then working to remove them gradually can be really helpful.
Yeah, definitely good point in terms of you might start with a higher frequency or a certain number of touches during the day, but progressively working toward decreasing that number. Sorry about that. The next question is that why lowering temperature techniques are not perceived as avoidant behavior, although that will become such a behavior. How to ensure that it won't be used as avoidant behavior in the future. Adults often use books, social media, naps, and going for a walk as avoidant behaviors.
I know there's 2 parts to that question. That is a fantastic question, and really great application of kind of like that balance of when is it avoidance or not. When we're doing exposures, we do not encourage children or parents to be using any of those lowering the thermometer techniques before, during, or after it, because we want to have them sit with that distress to see they can master it. If we lower the thermometer, they might learn, well, yeah, I could do it, but it was because I lowered the thermometer. However, there are many families or circumstances where getting to the exposures can be quite challenging. And as you are working towards building exposures or these gradual sitting with anxiety, lowering the temperature can be tools to use when the thermometer gets to a 5, a 4 out of 5, really, really hot, to cool it down enough that the child can continue with their day. Or before a child's ready to do exposures, like you're working to set them up and you're building that common language, but you want to give them some tools to cope. For example, for a child who's doing the separation anxiety, their mom goes to work, You might be working on those exposures over the weekend on days mom's not working, but during the week, if the child is really struggling while mom's at work, those lowering the thermometer skills might be some good ones to practice during the day if she's really, he or she's distressed. They're also really good ones to just practice at night before bedtime to cool down the thermometer and relax. Because we also just know that practicing things when you're not stressed builds the muscle better. I always talk about how, like, you know, no one would ever try like a new move in football or soccer, football, you know, in the championship game as their go-to. They'd want to have kind of practice it, right? So when the stress is on, they know how to use it in its second nature. So practicing these when they're calm and relaxed, so they know that if their thermometer gets too high and they're not actively doing their exposure, they have a tool. But I hear that if we want to not have them overly rely on them, that's why it's really critical. In addition to lowering the thermometer, we also are actively doing the exposures. Because if we only lower the thermometer, we're learning coping tools, but not mastery tools. And the exposure are the mastering anxiety tools. Dr. Hardin, I think you're on mute.
Yes, sorry about that. So the next question is managing emotions, angry outbursts, and trying to process them with the child. As you would expect, some kids, when they are upset, they have hard time processing their emotion, sometimes immediately after the event. So any thoughts in terms of how to revisit that and how to approach this?
Yeah, I think that probably resonates with a lot of parents, teachers, and coaches on this call. It's definitely something that I've worked with many families on. I've experienced when working with kids, certainly. And there's no perfect answer to that. The strategies I typically recommend are trying to build in like emotion talk into day-to-day practice. So sometimes having it be before bed of being like, what were the highs and lows today? So it becomes normative practice. It doesn't feel punitive, like, oh, we have to talk about what happened bad today, but it becomes a regular conversation. The other is making sure we say something around like, it sounds like it's really hard to talk about right now. The thermometer is really hot. I'm going to bring this back up and we'll talk about it again because I want to make sure I learn about it from you. But when the thermometer's lower, you're also then reinforcing those concepts of your thermometer's high. So they're learning that it will lower. What goes up does come down. And that we will revisit this, not in a punitive way of like, we're going to come back to this tonight later, but this is a conversation. I want to learn about this from you. Now that can be really challenging as a parent and coach when you're like, I really need to talk to my kid about this behavior. This is really problematic. And recognizing some of these are the long play and planting seeds. And if they're having negative or large emotions, it's going to happen again. And there's going to be many more opportunities for that. And so I think that can be one of the ways it's really helpful is carving out regular emotion time to talk about.
Yeah, I think the two thoughts here is that having an open invitation to the child that they can come at any time in the future when they feel ready to talk about it, having a structured time to revisit these topics, because some of us, if not all of us, sometimes when we're upset, we don't want to talk about something until the thermometer cools down. The other challenging thing, especially with kids, is sometimes they cannot express what's really upsetting them for cognitive developmental issues. And I've seen that with a lot of kids who they try to explain what's going on. It's very hard because cognitively they cannot do that. So that's why using imagery, some figures will be very helpful. And sometimes kids at age 5 or 6, they have very hard time expressing what's going on. if you continue to work with them, like when they are 7 or 8, they are more able to express some of these emotions. I know it's waiting 1 year or 2 years sounds too long, but unfortunately, we have to respect child development principle and the development of the specific individuals, especially in some boys where it's, you know, expressing emotion does not come as easy as in girls. Very good. So let's move to the next question that's translated from Russian from Dana. Good to see you, Dana. What if we deal with the phobia and we cannot move more than the first step? Should we focus on the first step or give up this idea?
Well, I would encourage you not to give up the idea, but that can be really challenging, and it's something that happens quite a bit. Without knowing the specifics, I'll give more broad-based response, but often what we can do is think about is perhaps is that step too high, or are there other steps before we get to it? We want to think in our ladder that we don't want the steps to be so far apart that a child's, like, the length of their leg couldn't reach to the next one, right? They're not ready. We want to think developmentally, can they get to it? Or do we need to build a step in between? Often, we actually will build mini staircases within it if the steps are too big. So for example, if someone's dealing with needle phobia, we may do several different steps to just get them comfortable seeing a needle. It might be looking at a picture of it, to looking at having like a play, like a kid's play set of a fake needle that they play doctor with when they're kids, to having the syringe without a needle in the room before they can even just look at it, to then having a needle just in the room, maybe a sewing needle, to then putting those two together. And that may be all one step before we move to the next one, which might be even just like holding a needle before we get to it. So thinking about ways we could even break the next step or this current step down to turn the volume up or the volume down on the next step to bridge it a little bit smoother. And you can collaborate with that with your child of being like, how could we make this a little hotter? How could we turn the volume up on this? Maybe make it a little longer. You can also make them playful, and that's okay too. So if one that's the next step up is hard, turning the volume down and being like, okay, but what if it's a sewing needle and, you know, it is magenta and we put it like hanging from the ceiling, like something silly or something like that. Or we look in a sewing store or something silly. So I would really encourage you to stick with it and to recognize that stuck points happen. And we're going to model that we're just going to try something different and different flexibility.
Very good. Thank you. The next one is commonly observed in kids with anxiety who bring back on a regular basis their past experiences and their failed past experiences. It's like a conditioned to expect failure in the context of working with anxiety. And the question is that, how do you work around that and what strategies would you suggest?
It sounds like, and again, not knowing this client, we want to have them behaviorally experience something positive, that the proof, I don't know the phrase, the proof is in the pudding, or like they need to live it themselves to see. They may also be discounting the times they have had positive experiences. And so what we see with anxiety is reassurance that, you know, the past discomfort's not going to happen is just not going to be enough with true anxiety. They need to live it and see it and learn it. And so my thought would be trying to find something, even the smallest thing, that will disprove that the bad thing happened, even if it's the smallest. So this is a very silly example, but some child was very scared that if they said, cross my heart, hope to die, someone was going to die, because the last time they said it, someone got very sick right after. And I've entirely de-identified this, so the child will not know who it is. But so we said things that just weren't true, and then said, cross my heart to die. Like I said, my hair is neon purple, cross my heart, hope to die. And then he said it to see that we made it playful and fun, but that the bad thing didn't happen. So I'm wondering for you if there's anything you can do that's even silly or playful to just disprove that the terrible thing will happen, even in the smallest way, to build a positive success. And then kind of slowly turn the volume up on those more and more. And try to be like, so what do you make of that? You did it and nothing happened. Makes sense. Again, validating why you would think or feel that the discomfort's going to happen again. Of course, I can hear why, given your past, that would happen. And what do you think you could try? What do you make of this?
Another strategy is, not, even though it's not ideal, is to coach someone, or coach, like bringing another child. If the child is concerned about the interaction with an adult or interaction with another child, is having an adult interact with the child and coach the adult to interact as nice as possible with the child, to help with developing these corrective emotional experience. And that's why sometimes in this situation, working in a therapeutic environment is very helpful, because the child gets to experience another adult, or in the context of social groups, some good experiences that will undo the negative experiences that they've experienced in the past. The next question is, habituation desensitization pattern that have been developed can sometimes harm the child in the future if they encounter a person who's not very appropriate, and who wants, and this individual would want to use the child, let's say in the context of pedophile, in the future. So how can that be avoided? So anyway, sometimes decreasing the anxiety about talking to stranger might make the child pay the price later on.
Yeah. And that's so important to be thinking about. How do we maintain that healthy sense of worry and fear of unknown and discomfort and uncertainty, to kind of have that, trust that? I think that, and Dr. Hardin, feel free to add to this. I think that there's two pieces that I often think about this. Is one, if a child has experienced unsafe circumstances with an adult, and you're trying to do work to help them recognize that other adults can be safe. When we have a past like trauma and it's trauma work, we do the exposure somewhat differently. So I want to highlight that piece. And I didn't cover that today. If it's not, and rather they have a fear, like Dr. Hardin says, of talking to new adults or trusting adults, we want to do exposures, but then recognizing that they can talk to adults. They still want to follow the regular safety cues, and you can review those with the family and them of if they ask them something unsafe, if they ask them these things, these are when you want to talk to an adult. And so kind of still having those limitations and stipulations. So it's very clear of not like, this is terrible, you can't be near it, but of being like, if this happens, oh yeah, of course you want to talk to an adult. If an adult is asking you to go somewhere by themselves with you, if they're asking this, you definitely we do not do that. Those kind of really firm boundaries of what's okay and not okay. While also recognizing it's okay to say like hello to someone or order at a restaurant.
Yeah, and that's why these desensitization should be done in the context of a therapeutic encounters, like with a therapist, so they can monitor a little bit that whether the kid is moving actually to the other, to becoming too friendly with people. And we don't see that in therapy. Actually, we unfortunately see it when there is a medication involved in the treatment, when the transition happens relatively quickly from being inhibited to maybe a little bit more, less anxious, to the point that you can talk to stranger. I'm mindful of the time, so that's why I'm going to try to go through the remaining question as fast as possible. question about where people can take CBT courses or get additional knowledge about CBT.
Well, there's some wonderful books, but I tried to find ones that were translated. Unfortunately, primarily they are in English, but the Beck Institute in the United States was created by the people who created cognitive behavioral therapy, or kind of the forefathers of it. We have no financial relationship with them or gain, so please don't think I'm recommending them for that. But that can be a great resource if you if you speak and learn in English.
Very good. Thank you. Next question, can the use of exposure in anxiety leads to disgust or mixed feelings? And is it rather a feeling of disgust than fear?
This question got me very excited because the answer is overwhelmingly yes. And there are actually a lot of exposures you can do around disgust. A lot of disgust can actually happen in obsessive compulsive disorder, which I treat, and just anxiety. So just as an aside, there are a lot of ways that instead of it being the fear goes down and they're not disgusted, it's that they learn that they can tolerate the disgust. They can feel the sticky thing, they can have that be gross, and they can do it, especially if you're focusing on functional things that they need to be able to do. So yes, you definitely can.
Very good, thank you. The last question is that how to deal with situation when a kid does not want to change anything while the situation is getting worse.
This question also excites me.
Good questions, good questions.
This question also excites me because that is, God, I wish I had a proportion of how often it happens, but it is so common, unfortunately. And it makes so much sense, right? Of like, if you're fearful of something, you're like, I don't want to work on this. So I didn't address it in this conversation, but we do have an evidence-based treatment called SPACE, Supportive Parenting of Anxious Childhood Emotions. It is out by Ellie Leibowitz at the Yale Child Study Center. And it is cognitive behavioral therapy for parents to working with kids who do not want to change their anxious behaviors. And there's research to show it's very successful in changing parents' response to the child's anxiety. I won't be able to go into it fully, but that would be something I would recommend looking into. He published a book recently about it. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Felgen. We really appreciate all the information that you shared with us and answering all the questions. And I want to thank everyone for attending. Please fill out the survey, and hopefully we'll see you soon. As I mentioned, next week we have the topic of addiction, and in adolescents, addiction, from alcohol addiction to other types of addiction, including screen addiction. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.